Okay, now we're into the advanced node tree. We're finally nearing the end of user training within Resolve. It won't be long now before there's just some professional practice and technical setup to go, and then we'll be done. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have some tools to go. To that end, let's cover the only node type we've yet to use, the Splitter Combiner node. The Splitter Combiner node lets us take the color channels that make up our image and split them up so that we can work on each channel separately within a dedicated corrector node, then reassemble those channels, including any adjustments that we've made. Now, this may sound like a fiddly thing to do, but it does have its uses, especially for things like layer mixers and noise reduction or blur sharpen with greater accuracy. So I've got an image from the Shadow vs Everyone project here, and I'm going to set up a Splitter Combiner node tree structure. That's easy to do, it's just Alt and Y. Now here we see the basic RGB splitter setup. The leftmost node is the splitter. It's splitting our image up into its three constituent channels, in this case red, green and blue. And the rightmost node is the combiner. It's collapsing those channels back into each other again and producing a full RGB image. As long as we don't do anything to the middle three nodes, nothing is going to happen. But if I make a change in the red channel, let's say if I increase the gain in the red channel, you can see that if I increase the values in the red channel, then the image goes red, because the red channel then has a higher set of values than the other two channels, thereby producing a red color cast. Now this still might not seem that useful, and in truth it's not very commonly used during most grading jobs, but it does have some cool features that can help out under the right circumstances. Now, my favourite use of this is something I learned whilst shadowing another colourist at Prime Focus in London quite a few years ago now. He showed me that you can get a better starting point for a bleach bypass grade if you extracted the green channel from your image and then used that for your silver layer instead of a standard desaturated version of the image. Now to do this, I've got my default splitter set up, and I need to of course make a layer mixer as well, so just give me a second whilst I do that. What we've got here is an image that's been split up into its three channels, but we have a serial node that contains our green channel represented as a black and white image, and when looking at the splitter node you will notice there are three coloured dots, a red, a green and a blue at the top, middle and bottom. This corresponds to which corrector node contains which channel. So the top node contains the red channel, the middle node contains the green channel, and the bottom node contains the blue channel. I'm going to take our green channel represented as a black and white image, and I'm going to use that as our silver layer in the composite in the layer mixer. Now, there are two reasons for doing this. A, any camera that uses a Bayer pattern color filter array, and remember that one from the red module, will have twice as much green as either red or blue. And this particular image was shot with an ARRI Alexa Mini, so it's definitely a Bayer pattern CFA. This means we have more contrast to work with, and the overlay isn't going to make our image as dark as the other two channels. And B, skin tones. Skin tones appear closer to 50% grey when viewed in the green channel in black and white. And remember that 50% grey has no effect in an overlay blend mode. This means we'll automatically do a better job of preserving skin tones whilst making a bleach bypass this way. Now I want the silver layer to be on the top of the layer stack, so remember, I need to connect that into the bottom input on my layer mixer. Now, we can treat this just like any other bleach bypass. I can go in, I can change my key output to scale it in, and there we go. We now have a fairly passable bleach bypass. So this is a really neat trick for the Splitter Combiner node. If you're up against the clock, then doing this for a bleach bypass can save you a little bit of time. It's just Alt-Y, then Alt-S, then Alt-L. That will make you a splitter node, a serial corrector and a layer mixer, and then you just need to plug your green channel into the bottom of your mixer node, and away you go. Just go ahead, change the key output, and there you go. It's quite a nice trick. I use it every now and again. I always like to put more detailed work into things when I have the time, but there have been one or two projects where I've just had to rush an effect out, and this is a very good way of producing a much better result much more quickly. So that was the first cool use of this, and we'll go through some other uses before we move on. So I'm going to get rid of my layer mixer here. Now there are other things we can do with these individual channels. For example, if I go into node sizing in my pan and scan options and change the zoom setting of the individual channel, you can see I can set up a crazy kind of chromatic aberration effect. I can even apply blur and sharpen to individual channels. Now, that's kind of a fun, funky effect, but it's really quite niche, and I've never actually used it in a real project because I've never had to produce a fake chromatic aberration like that during a grade. It's kind of a novelty thing, but it's there. Far more important is that we can use the splitter node to be more accurate with our noise reduction. Now, I'll tell you a secret about the blue channel. The blue channel has more noise hiding away in there than either of the other two channels. And the explanation for this can get pretty tech-heavy, but it's a combination of things. First, we have an image shot with a Bayer pattern filter, so twice as much green as red or blue. So the red and blue channels are at a disadvantage anyway. And also, a lot of current sensor technology has a tendency to be less sensitive to blue light. Now, as you might guess, we're going to use a splitter node to isolate the blue channel, and then we're simply going to apply our noise reduction to the node containing the blue channel at the bottom of this kind of stack of 3 down here. I can go ahead. I can add my standard noise reduction, and this does a better job of preserving image detail while still addressing noise that can be present in the image. Right, this has been a good introduction to the splitter and combiner nodes. If these seem a little high concept, then don't worry, it's not very common for us to make use of them. They're really more of a specific niche thing, and I tend to use them mostly for the bleach bypass trick or for containing noise reduction to individual channels. That being said, practicing with everything is going to make you a better colorist, so have a go and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Okay. Node trees can get a little wild, right? I mean, look at this one. So we're going to take a look at a really powerful way to keep everything under control. Much like we can nest clips or sequences in Premiere Pro or pre-compose in After Effects, we can also collapse multiple nodes down into a single node that contains all the separate components that went into it. This is called a compound node, and it's a lot like a nested clip, but for nodes in our node tree. We'll go through how compound nodes work. So here, you can see a fairly typical node tree for a drama grade. This is beginning to get a little gnarly, so what we can do is we can use a compound node in order to make this node tree easier to organize. Now, we've covered parallel nodes and layer mixer nodes before, and how they help us keep organized. And because they are a number of nodes grouped together based on a particular goal or function, they are the first and most logical candidates for becoming compound nodes. I've got a cluster of nodes here which are concerned with the bleach bypass effect. I'm going to place all the nodes concerned with this goal into the same compound node. I do that by selecting all the relevant nodes, which in this case is just a click and drag. And now I can right-click any one of the selected nodes and choose Create Compound Node from the bottom of the drop-down menu. Now all the selected nodes vanish and are replaced by a node that looks like a few playing cards stacked on top of each other. See the 3 separate upper borders up here. This is how you identify a compound node. Now this compound node contains all of the previously selected nodes, and because of that, anything I do to this node, such as repositioning it in the node tree, changing its key output, etc., happens to all the nodes contained within. This can make organizing my node tree much easier, and it can open up some truly mind-bending possibilities with the layer mixer nodes. Now, this is cool, but you might be wondering, I still have work to do. Won't I just do this right at the end, and in which case, what is the point? By then all the work's done anyway. Wouldn't it be better if I could edit the contents of a compound node or even copy them to other node trees? Well, there's good news. Editing the contents of a compound node is dead simple. You simply hold either Control for Windows or Command for Mac and double left-click the compound node. This will take us inside and we will see the contents of the compound node in our node tree. For those with experience of Premiere Pro or After Effects, this is just like going into a nested clip or a pre-composition. We can work on any of our nodes in here, and it will update our grade in real time, just like normal. Once we're done in here, we can click on the little white compound node down here, and that will take us back to the top level of our node tree for this shot. Compound nodes can contain other compound nodes, and if you find you're getting a bit lost, you have a convenient flowchart down here showing you where you are in your node tree. Because of this, it can certainly be helpful to change the node label and rename your compound nodes. So if we want to copy a compound node into another node tree, all we need to do is grab a still or right-click on that shot's thumbnail. So I'm going to take a still, I'm going to make myself a new album, and I'm going to take a still. And if I want to then move that compound node onto a different shot, I just need to display the node graph, and I can literally drag and drop the entire compound node into the node tree and it will have its full effect. And then I can double click and go into that as well and change it up for that shot. Now, at the time this video was recorded, we cannot yet save compound nodes as shared nodes. I certainly think that would be a great and powerful feature, but it's not quite there yet. Now, we're almost there, just 2 more things to go, and then we're done with this one. First, we can also grade a compound node, and this is essentially like working on a corrector node that just sits at the end of the compound node's internal node tree. It will happen after everything else in the compound node, so I can just get my primary wheels and just do whatever, and it will then just sit on top of that correction. It can be useful in some cases, but I find it quite easy to forget about what you've done on a compound node itself, and for this reason, unless I'm using a qualification to target a compound node's effects, I like to leave the compound node's color settings untouched if I can help it. And finally, we need to know how to take a step backwards. What if we collapse too many nodes or we change our mind? Well, breaking up a compound node is dead easy. We simply right-click on the node and choose Decompose Compound Node. This will erase the compound node and restore every node it contains in the correct order, retaining whatever settings they had at the time the node was decomposed. So we will not lose any work, we will not lose anything by doing this. So this was a good introduction to compound nodes. They really are one of the more advanced features in Resolve, so have a play around and see what you can do. They can be particularly fun when combined with layer mixer nodes, so see what you can do there. And click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Now we're going to take a look at the OpenFX plugins that come shipped with Resolve. Now this is one of the few lectures that covers some paid license features of Resolve, so if you're on the free version, feel free to skip this for now. OpenFX are visual effects plugins that can be installed and used within Resolve by adding different OFX plugins to corrector nodes in our node tree. With these effects, we can do things like generate lens flares, set up composites and add film grain, as well as make a number of color space and gamut transforms that can be helpful for higher-end broadcast work. Throughout this and the next few lectures we will be covering some of the more useful effects. Don't be limited to these though. Play around and experiment on your own to see what you can do. We're going to start with an overview of how the OpenFX work and then take a look at some of the most basic effects, the blur category. Effects can be applied to any corrector node we have in our node tree, or they can be added to our node tree as nodes of their own. What you choose to do depends on what you hope to accomplish. Generally speaking, I like to give most effects their own node unless they are something super basic like a blur. In order to apply an effects plugin to a node on the node tree, we first have to bring up the effects gallery, and we do this by clicking on the effects icon in the upper right up here. Now we can see a full list of all the effects that have been installed. Resolve supports the OpenFX format, so that means plugins from the likes of Boris FX can be installed directly into Resolve, providing they claim that Resolve is a valid host application. Now we can take a look through the first effects category, the blurs, and these are the simplest effects to use within Resolve, and they have their uses. I don't use these very often, but we'll take a look at how to apply and edit effects using them as they are an easy starting point. I'm going to add the first effects plugin to a pre-existing node, and then we'll go over the other method. To do this, I'm just going to drag and drop the Gaussian blur effect onto my last empty corrector node, and that will apply the effect to that particular node. Now we have an effects plugin active, and we can see the effects badge on the node, this little FX in a white circle down here. Before we move on, if we decide that we want to remove a plugin from a node, what we need to do is right-click and choose Remove OFX Plugin. Now we have an effects plugin applied to a node, and we can go about changing the controls up here in order to refine the blur. I've got the horizontal and vertical blur. Now this can be used to make a more sophisticated blur effect than the standard blur and sharpen tools we've seen before, but it's a fairly basic effect by itself. What's worth taking account of, though, is that most effects plugins respect any form of qualification that may be present on their node. So if I use a circular power window, and set it up like so, I can actually make a blurred vignette to my shot fairly easily. I can then click and drag these sliders to change the amount of blur I've got. I've got a black border at the moment, so on border type I can just choose replicate, and that will basically fill in any detail on the outside if we get a black border. If I uncheck gang, I can change horizontal and vertical blur independently and make a more kind of stylized looking vignette, should I choose. It's quite a bit more powerful than the standard RGB blur we had before. And at the bottom we have Global Blend. Global Blend basically fades the whole effect in and out. The higher Global Blend is, the less effect our effect is going to have, basically. When it reaches 1, it's invisible. When it reaches 0, the full effect of the OFX plugin is visible. So I can then drag this up just to tweak this out a little bit. There we go. And then I've got a nice kind of blurred vignette on this image here. Now, using secondaries with effects is key to using some of the more sophisticated effects we have, because otherwise they can be kind of blunt instruments, like they'll blur and sharpen the whole image, typically not what we want. So we have to keep in mind that we use most effects in conjunction with secondary keys or our power windows. Now, we have some other blur effects here. We have things like radial blur, which will make the image look as though it's spinning. We have a zoom blur, makes the image look like it's being zoomed in. And it's worth noting that we can only have a single OFX plugin on a node. If I drag another blur on, if I go back to directional blur will let me blur and then choose the angle of that blur as well. If I put another effect on top, it's going to erase the old one, so I do need to have separate nodes for different effects, and then of course I can use a compound node to collapse them all into each other and make them that much easier to handle. When I say I tend to give most OFX their own node, that means I make an empty corrector and put the OFX on that node as opposed to just dragging them onto the timeline. So this has been a good introduction to the Resolve Effects and OpenFX plugins. We're going to take a much more in-depth look at some of the more advanced and useful effects over the next few lectures, so click on through once you're ready. Right, so on to another important and useful effects plugin. The Face Refiner, and that sounds a little Soylent Green to me, is a tool that helps to automate the tasks commonly carried out on the faces on any on-screen talent. So things like vignettes, skin tone work, eye vignetting, etc. It can be useful, though it still has a few rough edges to be aware of. Now, this lecture is going to be a two-parter because working with faces is extremely important, and there's some new colour theory I need to share with you when performing some high-end beauty work. So, here we're back in the PC01 project. This is one of our contributors from way back, and we're going to use the Face Refiner in order to make some more sophisticated refinements to this contributor's face. Now, first, drag the Face Refiner onto our node tree, and then we need to hit the Analyze button. So I'm just going to drag the Face Refiner effect onto an empty corrector node. There we go. And the first thing I need to do is hit the Analyze button up here. That's going to carry out the tracking for the face mask automatically. So I'm just going to left-click this, and you can see it doing its thing. Now, he looks a little bit like the master control program right now, so I'm just going to go down here and I'm going to click off. And that stops the kind of blue-green interface from interfering with my work. Now, this has been improved since version 15, but I still find that it can struggle on faces turned 3/4 and in profile, so pick your fights with this one. That's not to say never use it if the talent isn't directly facing the screen, just don't expect miracles in every shot. So, let's take a look at some of the options we have here. First, we have the skin mask options, and these let us refine the qualification drawn to isolate the skin tones of the Face Refiner has identified. So first, we have Use Mask and Use Face Mask. Use Mask tells Resolve to make a secondary qualification similar to the HSL that we can then use to constrain the adjustments we're making within the Face Refiner. In most cases, we want this on. And we then have the Use Face Mask option. Because this is a fairly standard HSL key, we can of course get things that we don't want to work falling within the qualification. What the Use Face Mask checkbox does is place a circular power window around the tracked face automatically. Now, does all of this sound familiar? It's essentially an automation of what we would normally do with secondary keys and power windows across multiple nodes, all folded into one. Also, down here we have the Show Mask checkbox, and this will actually show us the mask we have for the face. Now, you can see that I'm shaving off the right-hand side of his cheek here, so I'm going to use Face Mask Size Up until I start to get all of the face, and then I'm going to up the softness a little bit, and I might tweak the Refine Mask just to get rid of some of the black holes here. So the Face Mask slider increases the size of the circular power window, softness is just the feather, and Refine Mask basically carries out some clean black and clean white operations on the HSL key we've got. So I'm just going to do that until I'm more or less happy. I'm going to take face mask down very slightly so I avoid this weird little white scrap we have kind of on his lapel down here. We don't want that. So I'm just going to bring that back in, and there, that's a pretty good face mask for the face refiner on this shot. Now that I'm done with this, I just uncheck show mask, and we can start the actual work. So, the next thing we have are the texture controls, and this allows us to smooth out blemishes in the skin. We also have an accompanying slider that reads amount and scale. These allow us to choose to preserve some skin details by defining the size of the details we preserve and how much they are preserved. We use a combination of these two sliders to achieve a desirable but also natural and convincing look. Now, I'm going to leave this as it is because I've got a separate lecture specifically on the subject of beauty work and the beauty effect, which has many of the same controls and a more advanced beauty function that you can access through the operating mode drop-down menu. So, just to reiterate, we're not going to do anything with the texture controls in this one. We're going to do a whole lecture on skin beauty work later on, and we'll use a much better dedicated beauty effect for that, not the face refiner. Now next, we have the color grading controls for the face refiner. Once we've set the skin smoothness and detail using the above sliders, we can then move on to more nuanced work on the skin tones. First we have contrast, and this obviously increases the contrast within the mask. I'm going to put that up until I'm happy, but I don't want the shadows to be too harsh, so about there. I don't want the right hand side of his eye there to look too dramatic. So that's just about right for me there, maybe just a little bit less. Then we have the mid-tone slider, and this will add a slight push to the mids, which is unsurprising. If you're a bit reckless with this, it can lead to a kind of weird glowing effect, which in most cases we don't want. So I'm actually going to bring my mids down a little bit. There we go. And just get that nice kind of contrast there. After that, we have tint, and this lets us push the skin tones towards red or orange or even magenta in some cases. It's a nice little touch to try and nudge the overall skin tones closer to where they need to be. Now he's looking a bit yellow, so what I can do is I can shift the tint over slightly. So if I go back, he's green. If I go that way, he's a bit magenta. What I can do is I can shift his skin tones. And tell you what, make it easier on myself, I'm going to bring up the vector scope. And you can see how that has an impact on that reading there. So I'm just going to bring it down until it's more on the eye line. There we go. That's looking like a better, kind of healthier, redder skin tone to me. Now we have color boost, and this is very similar to a saturation setting. I might just boost the color ever so slightly. I don't want to be too harsh with this one because it can appear to glow, and we don't want glowing skin tones. Maybe I'll just take my tint back down a little bit more. Okay, there we go, that's better. That's better for it there. Okay, so next we have the Desaturate Shadows slider. Now, remember how we get that odd glowing quality in some of the troublesome shadows, especially on foliage and skin? Desaturate Shadows is a great shortcut to dealing with that when working on faces. We mostly see the effect on this in the shadows around the chin and in the place where the jaw seems to meet the neck. So I'm just going to play around with Desaturate Shadows. And the shadow in his right eye is looking a little bit colourful. So I can just bring that down ever so slightly, like not too much. There we go. And that's a pretty good place for his skin to be in. And finally, we have shine removal, which, as the name implies, dulls down the shine on the face we're working on by pulling down highlights and making them more similar to the values surrounding them. This is good if we have problems with blown out or particularly shiny faces, let's say if it's a hot day on shoot or there's some awkward natural lighting to deal with. So I'm now going to play around with shine removal, and if I drag it up you can see that it kind of brings those highlights on his face down and we get kind of a matte look. Or I can inversely bring it down and I can actually exaggerate the model on his face by increasing those highlights. That looks a little bit kind of shiny plastic to me. I think by default, the exposure on his face is looking pretty good. I might actually be tempted just to drag it down slightly and get a little bit more detail out of those highlights. Ever so slightly, just to kind of accentuate the model here. Now, the other way I would do this is just to pull a secondary on the highlights on the face and then do it that way, but this is much easier. I get less control, because I can't really define what a highlight is within the mask, but I quite like that. So I'm going to take a before and after look at this. And that's nice. I definitely think that's an improvement. There are still a few little issues here or there. His skin is all the same color, and in the next lecture we're going to talk about that a bit more. But for now, this is a good first pass on our face refiner. So this was pretty quick, so take your time and play around with the sliders. Try and get a feel for the impact we'll have. We're going to call it here for this lecture, and we'll continue with the advanced controls in the next one. So click on through to the next lecture once you're ready. Right, back again, and this time we're going to finish it. Let's go over the advanced controls for the face refiner. Now, before we move on to the really advanced stuff, we'll go over the eye retouching controls. The eyes are, of course, super important, as they are the most expressive part of a human face and therefore play the largest role in our emotional connection with the on-screen talent. The eye retouching controls work only within the regions of the face that the face refiner has defined as the eyes, which should not surprise anyone. If we want to look at what the face refiner has identified as the eyes, what we need to do is go into our drop-down menu on our program viewer down here and choose the Open Effects Overlay option, and here we can clearly see the eye masks created, and they look pretty good for the most part. Then we'll go back to off so that it doesn't get in the way when we're judging the grade that we've done. And I'll zoom in a bit on the eyes as well. I want to be able to see these. We've got 4 controls here, and they are mostly self-explanatory. Sharpening does just that. It will sharpen the eyes within the eye window, created by the face refiner. Brightening brightens the inner eyes up. Now be careful with both of these. Less is more, especially with the brightening effect. In the older version of the face refiner, the brightening effect had the unfortunate side effect of making the eye windows created by the face refiner rather obvious. The track wasn't great, and they used to kind of judder and dance around a bit, which meant that I didn't used to use the face refiner a great deal once it was introduced. It's improved a great deal now, and if I drag up the brightening slider, you can see what I mean. If I just play this on a loop with brightening turned up to max, you can begin to see down there little bits of juddering, little bits of kind of dancing around where the track's not great. So just be very careful when using the brightening setting on the face refiner. It cannot be too high because it will give you away. I'm going to say about 0.3 is okay here. And I might turn up the sharpen by 0.1. Next is the eye light. This effect works in an eye mask shape around the eyes themselves and has the effect of either brightening or darkening the areas immediately around the eyes. It can be useful if the face hasn't been lit too well, or it can be used to add a bit of extra drama in certain cases as well. So if I drag the eye light up, you'll see there's kind of like a bandit's mask shape around his eyes, like kind of a Lone Ranger mask, and we're working within that, and I can choose to either brighten it up, or I can actually darken it down and add a bit more shadow to his eyes as well. Now I don't want to lose his right eye in shadow completely, so I'm going to bring my eye light up ever so slightly, maybe about 0.25. And if I start to take a look, we can see the effect that's had. Now I think the sharpening's a little bit aggressive there, so I'm going to take the sharpening down to about 0.04. There we go. I'm just going to play this now, take a look. What I don't want is eye windows being too obvious. When I zoom out a little bit. Okay, those look good to me. Always use a light touch with the eye controls because the tracking on the eyes is not perfect. Now, finally, we have eye bag removal, and this is exactly what it sounds like, and it helps us reduce the appearance of bags under the talent's eyes. A light touch is best here, but it can be very useful to make a contributor look a little bit more youthful, and believe me, corporate types are very keen on maintaining appearances. Make a small tweak here now, and we can see the effect it has. Now, I don't want it to be kind of 100, because that's a bit much, but I can go up to about 0.35, 0.4 here, and there you can see the effect that's had. I'm just going to make that play. I might turn bag removal down to about 0.3 or 0.33. And we can see in particular the eye bags are now far less obvious, but we don't have a very obvious artificial section. Let's just turn it down a little bit. But we don't have a kind of super obvious section here that we've worked on, which is very important. So I'm quite happy with the effect that's had. Just making sure the skin key was good. Thought I spotted a secondary error here, but that's absolutely fine. And there we go. That's the eye bags removed there. So this is our kind of eye retouching pass. And if we play through, I do think that's quite a nice improvement. It frustrates me that we cannot toggle off and on by category down here. We just have to turn the entire node off and on. So it's difficult to tell exactly what we've done with just the eyes because it's also folded into the overall face grade. In future versions of Resolve, I do hope to see a kind of categorized turn on, turn off button down here, kind of toggle off and on, so we can more easily appraise the work that we've done. Now, before we move on, I need to talk to you about some quite important colour theory to understand regarding idealized depictions of the human face in portraiture. So give me a second. And I've got something here that looks really weird, but it actually makes perfect sense. So, the face is not all the same colour. Remember when I told you not to use the colour compressor inside a skin key? This is why. We have a natural variation of hues all over the human body, and this depends on factors like blood vessels being close to the skin, subcutaneous fat, veins, all kinds of things. If we see someone who is made to look entirely the same colour, then the effect is unnatural. Now, the face is particularly important. It's a key feature we use to identify a person's emotional state, and it's what helps us make the strongest, most immediate connections to a performance. So you can imagine we might spend a little bit of extra time getting the talent's face just so. Now, up until this point, we've been doing only very basic beauty work. We've warmed up the skin, increased the saturation, but we haven't really done anything super intensive. To do just that, we must understand the following. There are 3 zones on the human face in portraiture, and each has a bias towards a particular colour. As you can see here, I've made corrections here with the linear window just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So we'll start off with the first colour region of the face. The forehead is more yellow or white. We then have the cheeks, and these are always more red or orange. And we then have the chin, which is typically more blue or green or possibly a kind of greyish cyan colour. Maintaining these general trends in colour will produce a more natural and pleasing looking rendition of a human face. Now, that is not to say that these colour biases are super obvious all the time. You never want a face to look like this kind of Neapolitan ice cream thing I've got going on here, okay? This is just to illustrate that we have 3 separate colour sections on a face when we work on a face. In reality, it's going to be far more subtle, and we'll go over how we do that with the face refiner in a second. Now, it might sound pretty difficult to split the face up into these 3 regions manually. You'd have to do 3 separate power curves all tracked and rotoscoped, but we don't have to, because, going back to my previous version, the face refiner does that automatically for us. If I go back to the window, it's going to draw a region above the eyebrows, between the eyebrows and the tip of the nose and the chin, and those will be its 3 main colour regions for the face. You'll notice we have controls for the eye, lip, blush, forehead, cheeks, and chin already. All of these controls have the same 2 sliders, plus 1 extra in some cases, and all of these controls have the hue and saturation sliders, which you also know by now will deal with hue and saturation. In this case, I'm going to ignore the lips because the lips are small here, and because I'm dealing with a male subject, I'm going to ignore blush as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight to cheek retouching down here. I've got forehead, which has a smooth option for crow's feet as well. I'll just unfurl all these 3. Now, looking at this face, I think it's probably a little bit too close towards yellow already, so I think I can leave the forehead alone in terms of hue and saturation. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to nudge the cheeks a little bit towards red to get a better kind of variation of hue in this face. And if I do yellow, it's green, you can see the region it's doing, and I'm just going to drag these up, and I'll maybe buff up the saturation very slightly. That's a gaming term, buff the saturation. I will increase the saturation very slightly, and here you can see how I now have a more natural variation between that kind of yellowish forehead and the cheeks which are going a little bit redder. Now I don't want them to go too pink and I don't want this to be too obvious. So I'm going to play around with it until I'm happy. And I'm quite happy for that cheek colour there, and I think the forehead looks good. With the forehead, I might just turn up the smoothing option a little bit. And the smoothing option kind of tries to hide some blemishes. We're going to go over beauty work in much more detail in another lecture, so don't worry, we can just play with this setting for the time being. But if I drag this up, it's going to start reducing the impact of crow's feet and blemishes on the forehead. And I might just say 1 is obviously far too much, 0.3 might just help out here. I might just boost up the colour. In fact, no, you know what, I'll leave the forehead alone, I think the forehead's fine. So now, remembering what our third region is, chin retouching, I typically want the chin to go closer to either blue or green. And I don't want this to be too obvious, so it's going to be quite a gentle touch here. Obviously I don't want him to like turn into an orc or whatever down here. So maybe negative 0.1 is enough. And I might actually just kill the saturation ever so slightly down here because it's natural for the chin to be a little bit more grey. And I might just... bring that down to 1.5. And again, these things are never super obvious. We're not going to have like white forehead, bright red cheeks like Ronald McDonald. It's just a slight variation in hue, and I might just bring that down ever so slightly, maybe 1.5, 1.5. Cool, and it just helps. You see how we have a very flat, uneven, like kind of very flat and even looking skin tone there, and here we just have slightly more healthy looking complexion, maybe even like 0.1. 0.1. And it's just a very slight hue variation in the cheeks we're introducing and making a very slight variation down in the chin here, which is cool. So I've got my face exactly where I like it, and we can see before and after. I think that's quite a dramatic improvement here. Maybe the eye bags are a little bit fierce, so what I'll do is I might just take my eye bag removal down to like maybe 1.5. Or 0.15 I should say. And I might take my eye light down to 0.175. There we go, make it a little bit less obvious, and maybe bring eye brightening down to 0.2. I'm just concerned the eyes looked a little bit fake before, but now I think that looks fine. So we can see this has had quite a nice impact on the face we've got here. It's a big improvement over like the standard flat yellow skin tone we had before. We've smoothed out some blemishes on the forehead, we've improved the eyes, we've got a natural variation in hue on the forehead, the cheeks and the chin as well. So this has made a big improvement to our image, and it's actually done so in a fraction of the time it would take for me to go around and, you know, cut out the forehead, cut out the cheeks, cut out the eyes, cut out the chin. I used to have to do it that way, it took forever, and this is a much better way of doing it. So there's one last setting we're going to take a look, and then we're going to take a look at how we might finesse the mask whilst using the face refiner as well, because the default secondary and skin keys are not always the best options. But there's one last slider we're going to take a look at, and that is called Global Blend. Now the last thing I'm going to do is tweak the overall effect using the Global Blend slider. This is basically like an opacity setting for the whole face refiner effect and the visible effect that it has. The higher we set Global Blend, the more the effects of the face refiner seem to fade out until we eventually return to the original version of the face. And if I turn Blend up to 0, it will disappear. At 0.5, it will be half and half. At 0, it'll all be there. So in grading, we often push a little bit too far and then dial it back, and this is no different. I'm going to push the Global Blend up a smidge so that the effect I have is not too obvious or jarring. So I'm going to put Global Blend up to maybe 0.15. There we go, and then it's not too strong or too obvious, and now I've got a really nice, quite in-depth, very accurate and targeted grade of this face using this tool, which is much, much faster than the standard kind of, track a circular window or rotoscope a power curve options we've been using up until now. So, there are a few flaws here, chiefly being that the original skin mask and the tracked face, like the face mask, are not great by themselves. They can be okay on some shots, and other shots we need to do something else. We need to do something better. So if we want to use a mask of our own, what I have to do is I have to uncheck Use Mask. And now, whilst the face is still identifying eyes, nose, lips, forehead, cheek and chin, it's not actually targeting its corrections within a mask of any kind. But what I can do, I can actually pull a key of my own on this node, and then the effect applied to this node will only happen inside that key. So for example, I will draw a obvious triangular shape here, and you can see that the face refiner effect is only taking place within this power window. So that then gives us an answer as to how do we fix an automatic key that's a bit naff. Well, we pull our own. I can pull a key on the skin, until I'm happy with it. And then, usual trick in combination, with that I can then use a soft mask tracked to the face, and here now I have got my face refiner constrained within a mask of my own design. So you do not have to use the automatic skin mask and face mask tools if you do not want to. They are certainly useful, but we can make a more accurate mask ourselves if we want. One thing to be aware of, should you choose to work this way though, is that if you pull a key of your own, one thing to be aware of is that should you do it this way, you can actually, and if we look very closely, you can actually restrict the region of the eyes you're working on with the key that you pull. So in order to get this right, we'd have to do a different approach. What we would have to do, and let me just reset everything here. What I would have to do is I would have to set up a tree containing 2 nodes and also a key mixer. And I would have to pull a skin key, and then B, tracked windows for both eyes, and combine those two together, and then feed the combined key into the face refiner. So I'll do that just now. On this top node, I'm going to key the skin. Now that's great for the skin, not so great for the eyes, but that's okay. So now, on this bottom node, I'm going to have to quickly track the eyes. And then I'll make a second curve, and I will track these eyes. Again, being careful to make sure that they do not go outside of the face. And I will then track that. Cool. So now, you can see that I actually have a mask in this node, which does include the eyes, and now when I change the eye mask, when I change the eye grade, you'll see that I do not restrict my eye corrections using this method. Last thing to do would be to make the garbage matte for the face over here. Make sure I don't get any of that annoying red column in the background. And here, maybe I can fix that little janky bit in the eyebrow. And now when I go back here, I have an almost perfect mask for the face. I could maybe matte out this bit down here. I could improve some other things. But then here we go. I've now got my face refiner effect within a mask of my own definition and my own creation, so you do not have to use the automatic effects. So this was quite a good in-depth look at the face refining tool. We're going to be taking a closer look at what we call beauty work in the next lecture, so click on through once you're ready.